Hello, my name is Ann Ewan. I'm the Chief Curator of Art and Heritage here at the Whyte Museum. I'm standing in front of the Mather Cabin, which is one of 8 historic structures on the Whyte Museum property. It was built by Bill Mather, who came west in about 1890. And as you can see, it's a pretty sturdy looking feature. It has dovetailed corners. There's a vent the shape of a ship's steering wheel that was put in 1940s when a man by the name of Captain Jack Stanley worked for Mather up at Lake Minnewanka. The building was also used for about 20 years as a tourist rental cabin. Let's see, it was 1973 that the cabin was moved here. It used to be across the Bow River, and there was all kinds of building and progress going on, so it was moved here. There's one story that's told about this cabin that I find quite interesting, and it was during the era that the Mather family lived in the house. Apparently, Mrs. Mather bore a child in the cabin, and while the floodwaters of the Bow River swirled around the interior, the story is embellished by the fact, or fiction, that the doctor arrived for the delivery wearing hip waders. Anyway, adding to the history of the cabin, this past summer, the Whyte Museum invited local artist Michael Corner to test the space as a potential studio residency. And as a result, Michael produced a strong body of work, which is now on display at the Whyte Museum in the Philippe Delesalle stairway. The exhibition runs till April 4th, 2022, so please, if you get a chance, come and see his work. It gives me great pleasure to introduce Michael Corner.
Spending time in this cabin, in the Mather family cabin, was a humbling experience. People surrounded by this wilderness in a cabin of this size, and the only barrier between you and the elements, these cheerfully pink walls and its friendly blue floor, but a sense of almost menace from the elements and just the vulnerability of being in the mountains at a time where you're just so far removed from civilization, and to have been removed from civilization, so to know what you have lost. It's really incredible to think about. I showed up and it was cold, and I think it was raining, and it was almost winter, or at least it felt that way. And I spent the first week sort of acclimatizing to being in here, and I just sort of started to depict everything around me. And gradually I started to look outside, and it became warmer, and I eventually started painting in the yard, or part of being on the lawns behind the cabin, different views of the exterior, which had been the interior, and the other buildings on the grounds. And gradually I started to bring other people into the cabin itself, and working with them kind of was a stimulus to different ideas about what it would mean to have multiple people living in a space like this, or just what you were to do with it. And eventually it ended up in a somewhat almost abstract form. I started to really consider the presence of the river, which would have been relatively near, I suspect, and the trees and the wilderness, and just as time went on, you could just imagine years going on, and this is it. There's nothing but this cabin. Working with models in here was great. They were as terrified as the place as I was. It was cold and unwelcoming, and there were no soft surfaces. So the sense of having to live in a time where people tried a lot harder was very real for both of us. It was interesting working with people, and that you get a sense of how small this cabin actually is. And it makes you think about a family living here and people coming and going, and it's remarkable. But the models themselves, it was just a really uncomfortable experience for them and for me. We found places for them to sit, and it was long hours, and you really felt the isolation. The strangest thing about painting is it exists outside of our attempts to describe it, and all you have are the feelings that surround you. So the atmosphere of this cabin forced me to acknowledge a certain sense of loneliness and isolation and a feeling of being removed from everything that's comfortable and familiar. It was something I couldn't put into words, but it started to show up in the paintings themselves, whether that was paintings of the cabin, in that the sink in a sense became my companion, and I would just stare at it hour after hour, and eventually it became the subject of a painting. There was literally nothing else to look at, and the entire place created its own paintings, and it was an intangible element. It was just the feeling demanded something to, or made demands on what was to be represented.
So, being our first resident of this cabin, what words of advice or wisdom would you give to future painters or writers embarking on a studio time here?
To really think about how it feels to be in this space. It's very unsettling. It's its own space. There's a strange juxtaposition between the cheerful colors of the cabin and then the actual sense of being present in it. And they don't align. And in that space, I think you find the motivation to think about things differently. You have a lot of considerations about what it would mean to live in a world that didn't exist for you until it did. To embrace the cabin. It provides an opportunity to consider things in a new direction, in a light that you probably haven't thought about before. Long, cold days. This cabin is always chilly. It's never not at about the temperature we're sitting in right now, which was good during the 40-degree days until the mosquitoes came. But it was humbling. I can't get the idea that people lived in this space, and of course I can't really speak to that. It's a bit of a fantasy of my own, but it really started me thinking about what that would be like to leave a world behind and to show up in this one, and to just be in the wilderness by yourself with everything that surrounds you being uncertain. It was very strange. The second the door closed and I just worked in here, it became very quiet, and you felt that sense of isolation. And I could imagine family members coexisting and living together, and just the feel of enclosure was just really quite something. I was only in here for a couple of months, but by the end, things had gone rather bleak around the edges, and my forms started to disintegrate and shapes started to lose their coherence. So it was interesting to see the effects it had with the progress of time. Not saying there is something so remarkable about having to consider other people's lives from a standpoint that's completely unreachable. Like it's all fantasy for me, but it really makes the imagination consider things that you just normally wouldn't. I mean, that's you literally spending a couple of months in a different building changes the whole direction of your work. You know, it's very strange. No.